In this podcast episode, host Rich Roll engages in an insightful conversation with Mark Manson, a prominent author and thinker in the self-help space. They explore a wide range of topics concerning personal growth, transformation, the pitfalls of goal setting, the nature of change, and the nuances involved in the pursuit of self-improvement. The episode also delves into common challenges such as procrastination, people-pleasing, self-sabotage, and the often misunderstood concept of manifestation. Throughout their discussion, both emphasize authenticity, humility, and self-awareness as crucial components for sustainable change. Mark opens by addressing the perennial frustration with New Year's resolutions, noting that many people abandon them by February. He attributes this failure to two main factors: the setting of vanity goals disconnected from personal values, and the lack of realistic integration of these goals into daily life. The enthusiasm and willpower at the start often overlook practical constraints like family obligations or unanticipated events, leaving people unprepared when initial motivation wanes. He stresses the importance of choosing goals that resonate deeply by identifying the feelings these goals are meant to produce, such as wanting to feel fit rather than merely aiming to run a marathon. Moreover, Mark challenges the cultural expectation of setting goals annually, suggesting it's better to seek clarity first than to commit to arbitrary goals under social pressure. Both Mark and Rich share evolving perspectives on positive thinking. Mark reveals his previous skepticism toward the positive thinking train, but acknowledges how research into resilience forced him to reconsider. He highlights the nuanced role of positive affirmations, explaining they may be ineffective or even detrimental during times of comfort, but become critical aids when one faces hardship, serving as a form of self-efficacy that bolsters endurance. Rich supplements this by reflecting on his upbringing, emphasizing that while blind optimism may seem cringeworthy, positive thinking combined with action fosters momentum necessary for growth. Both agree that positive thinking alone isn't enough. It must be complemented by behavior and experiential evidence. The discussion moves into the psychology of procrastination, which Mark describes as primarily an emotional regulation issue rather than a problem of laziness or poor organization. Procrastination is framed as a defense mechanism to avoid uncomfortable feelings such as anxiety, shame, or overwhelm. He offers a practical solution he calls the minimum viable action, where one shrinks intimidating tasks into the smallest possible steps to reduce fear and gain momentum. Rich relates procrastination to exposure therapy and emphasizes that repeated action builds a form of emotional muscle, enabling better management of avoidance tendencies over time without relying solely on productivity hacks. Both reflect critically on the self-help industry, cautioning against figures who exploit vulnerability through manipulative marketing that preys on insecurities. Mark singles out Tony Robbins as an example of someone who, despite offering valuable advice, also participates in aggressive selling tactics aimed at vulnerable audiences. They emphasize the ethical responsibility of influencers to maintain transparency and humility, warning against those who present themselves as saviors with all the answers. The parasocial nature of these relationships often feeds unhealthy expectations, and discerning consumers are advised to value experts who admit fallibility and demonstrate willingness to revise their views. When asked about the difference between passion and purpose, Mark defines passion as an activity enjoyed purely for its own sake, independent of external rewards, while purpose often involves a sense of duty or responsibility, sometimes without immediate enjoyment, such as parenting. Purpose is seen as a byproduct of engaging in actions that combine personal gifts with meaningful contribution to others. Rich adds that many people confuse passion with obsession due to exaggerated connotations and encourages narrowing the definition to what genuinely brings joy and curiosity. Both agree that purpose emerges organically through ongoing engagement with one's passions rather than through conscious, upfront declarations. Mark advises critical reflection before committing to any goal, especially cautioning against vanity goals lacking personal significance. He highlights the importance of accounting for lifestyle realities and energy demands that may impact consistency. Regarding whether to share goals publicly, They suggest that telling others can be beneficial if it serves an accountability purpose, but detrimental if it seeks premature validation or approval. Protecting creative or personal goals from external noise until fully nurtured is also recommended, striking a balance between accountability and privacy to foster authentic motivation. Mark offers a contrarian stance, describing the inner voice as often overrated and unreliable outside of specific decision-making contexts. He likens it to an obnoxious sibling whose chatter need not be taken seriously, emphasizing that meditation helps cultivate the ability to detach from these automatic thoughts. Rich agrees, but cautions that true intuition, a quieter, wiser self beyond impulsive reactions, exists but must be cultivated through self-awareness and sobriety from emotional hijacking. Both agree that distinguishing intuition from impulsiveness is key, as many misinterpret urges or desires as gut feelings, which can lead to poor decisions. The episode tackles the controversial claim that people don't change. Mark interprets most transformations he observes not as wholesale reinventions, but rather the removal of layers, allowing someone to be more authentically themselves. He stresses that change often manifests as greater self-acceptance rather than dramatic personality shifts. Rich acknowledges the genetic and biological constraints shaping personality traits, but argues people underestimate their capacity for gradual change. He believes many fail to imagine their future selves as different from their present selves, limiting their willingness to evolve. Both respect the slow, nuanced process of change and urge rejecting rigid notions of fixed identity. Addressing chronic people-pleasing, Mark challenges listeners to identify what they are willing to be disliked for, highlighting that such a boundary is essential for authentic living. People-pleasing is portrayed as an outsourced sense of self-worth, driven by external approval, which ultimately distances individuals from their true desires. Both guests recognize that overcoming this pattern requires developing a new identity and filling the void left behind by the need to please. Rich admits a residual tendency for social adaptability, but notes greater awareness prevents falling back into old habits. The discussion underscores how people-pleasing can function as a hidden coping mechanism rather than an innocent virtue. Mark explains that self-sabotage, especially near goal completion, often involves deep identity conflicts and subconscious resistance to change. Holding on to a problem can become a core part of one's identity, making resolution feel like a loss or threat. Rich elaborates by pointing out the emotional utility of victimhood and the moral righteousness it confers, which some people unconsciously perpetuate. Both underscore the necessity of understanding the emotional needs beneath self-defeating behaviors and finding new, healthier ways to satisfy them. This exploration reveals how change is impeded by psychological architecture more complex than simple willpower. Both critique the resurgence of manifestation culture, particularly on platforms like TikTok. Mark differentiates between passive manifestation, the unproductive belief that thinking alone attracts outcomes, and a more active manifestation, involving focused intention and consequent action. He dismisses the cosmological explanation as fanciful, suggesting instead that manifestation basically works by tuning one's attention to previously unnoticed opportunities. Rich agrees, but also defends the value of embracing mystery and alignment with life's flow, suggesting that a humble openness can facilitate serendipity and positive outcomes beyond logical comprehension. They converge on the idea that manifestation language, while metaphorical, serves psychological and motivational functions despite lacking rigorous scientific basis. In confronting the feeling of being too late for change, Mark tells an inspiring story of a woman who began learning piano at 62 and mastered it over decades, challenging assumptions about aging and neuroplasticity. Both guests emphasize the inaccuracy of how people perceive time, highlighting the vast potential for growth even in later life. They reject fatalistic attitudes towards aging, affirming that long-term commitment can yield significant transformation and fulfillment at any age. This conversation offers hope and perspective for listeners reluctant to begin anew due to chronological concerns. The conversation concludes by confronting the role of pain in the process of change. Mark clarifies that while one does not have to be in pain to change, pain often acts as a lubricant, breaking down resistance and stimulating willingness to act. Willingness is portrayed as an elusive, somewhat mysterious impulse that cannot simply be summoned, but is often sparked by discomfort strong enough to outweigh fear of the unknown. Rich concurs, noting that capacity to engage with hardship is a vital life skill and that practicing facing difficulties prepares one for meaningful change. The ultimate message is a call for acceptance of suffering as an integral, unavoidable part of growth.